Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up, so let's get started right away. This is episode 10 of the Project Doctor podcast series, where I talk about the project canvas. The canvas is a map of the project landscape, and it's divided into 12 tiles. I have described it in the first episode. In this 10th episode, I'm going to talk about deliverables. Now they say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So have you ever been nervous about your project deliverables? Were you wondering if they would work as expected when put into use? Or if they would have the quality level needed in real life? Or have you ever had to push back in order to prevent some scope creep in your project? I think every project manager has struggled with these things. For sure, I know I have. So keep listening and I will share some insights and practical advice for you. Also, don't forget to visit the site projectdoctor.online to download the extras for this episode. Now I'll be covering the deliverables in two parts. First, producing deliverables and then using the deliverables. Let's start with the first one. The deliverables have a life cycle. Let me first remove a possible wrong idea that you might have about deliverables. They do not only materialize towards the end of the project, but they have a full life cycle. In fact, I think deliverables are there in your project from the very first beginning. It's just that they change appearance with every phase in the project. First of all, they're just a vision. And then step by step they materialize until finally your project has created the tangible and usable end product. It's probably not exaggerated to say that at least half the work in any project has to do with deliverables in some phase of their coming into existence. Maybe even more than half. From the sponsor's expectations, that I've covered by the way in episode 9 of this series, to stating the project goals, I've talked about that in episode 2, and then gathering requirements and creating the design, which I have discussed in episode 6. All these steps are a process of what's called operationalization, going from the abstract/vague to the ever more specific. With every step, there is an activity of filling in the details. And operationalization is exactly that, turning abstract concepts into measurable and tangible things. Implicit expectations are put into words as goals, which makes them a bit more tangible, which are then translated into requirements, yet again a bit more tangible, which are then redefined into a design and finally given some physical presence in the actual deliverables. So this process of operationalization is, I think, a core process in every project. And it also defines the cone of uncertainty aspect in project management. And by the way, I've talked about the cone of uncertainty in episode 1 of my other podcast series called The Notebook. But this key process of operationalization has inherent risks. Several things can go wrong, and they are called underdetermination, reductiveness, and lack of universality. So let's dive a bit deeper into these 3 ways that things can go wrong in operationalization. So these are actually generic risks in every project. The first one being underdetermined. That means that a concept can have different meaning depending on the social setting. And I have a very nice example of that. It's about user interfaces, which create a problem if the software is used in various different countries. I've seen one case where a debugging software contained an option for step-by-step tracing that was represented by an icon of steps, basically impressions of shoe soles. When this software was introduced for development teams in the Emirates, it led to serious unease for the intended users, because in the Arab world, showing the soles of your shoe is a way of gravely insulting people, showing deep contempt. So in the social setting of this user community, it looked like the software was insulting the user. These deliverables were underdetermined because the icons have a different meaning associated with them in different social settings. The second risk with operationalization is called being reductive, meaning that you can miss or overlook meaningful aspects that are there, but you just don't see them. Basically, it boils down to engineers filling in the gaps with their own ideas and assumptions and not cross-checking with the expectations of key stakeholders, like the end user or the sponsor. As an example, in the high-level requirements for a logistics software module, it was described that order handling should be supported, and this was operationalized into designs for order picking and returns handling. However, some less common situations, like out of stock and the occasional cross-stocking, were overlooked, and these functionalities were therefore missing from the end product. The deliverables were in this case reductive, meaningful aspects had been missed. As another example, suppose the specifications for a form that people should be able to fill in their gender, the engineers have operationalized this as a Boolean, stating either male or female, but that leaves out people who define themselves as non-binary or bisexual or other. The way the form is operationalized as a deliverable is reductive, because aspects that are important for many users were clearly missed. The third risk with operationalization is a lack of universality, meaning that you're being too context-specific, which makes the product unusable in other contexts, where it should still be expected to work. There is an interesting example from a space navigation system, which apparently stated that end users should be able to view the measurements in either metric or imperial units. But when implemented, the engineers failed to implement conversions between what users with different units would see. This led to the system failing to serve even its primary function, and a space capsule crashed on the planet Mars. The deliverables clearly had a lack of universality, because the design was considering only either metric or imperial units, and was therefore too context-specific. So the takeaway here is, be aware that the process of operationalization can go wrong in several different ways, and this can happen in every step along the way. It's only a rigorous cross-checking of requirements against specifications, and then specification against deliverables or components that can help you find such errors before they hit reality. The tool Quality Function Deployment, which I mentioned in episode 6 of this series, is one such tool. But basically any tool for requirements tracing will help you, and the better tools for architecture and design will definitely support these techniques. Next, I want to talk about scope creep, which is a thing that frequently happens in many, if not all, projects. It could be defined as additional elements of functionalities or modules being added to the list of deliverables. In an unstructured way, that is. Otherwise, we are just basically adjusting the baseline of the project. Scope creep, of course, is a problem because it leads to additional efforts that either eat away the buffer you have wisely budgeted into the project, Or it leads to a budget deficit and therefore a problem with your sponsor. After all, she mandated you only for the allocated budget and not beyond. On top of that, any additional efforts from scope creep also means that your timeline is getting into the danger zone. So scope creep can only be resolved in a few ways. Either you negotiate with the sponsor for a new baseline with modified budget and timelines, or you find a way to increase productivity so you can absorb the scope creep within the baseline of budget and milestones. Or finally, you decide to absorb the scope creep within any contingency that you have, both in budget and in planning. However, if you do that early on in the project, you take a risk on future events that may happen and for which you then don't have any contingency left. Let me give you an example of how scope creep could work. In a major project that I managed, we were doing a complete overhaul of all the software systems for a retail chain. The deliverables were quite well defined from the outset, as we had representatives from all the business areas involved in the planning phase, where the product breakdown was defined and the effort estimations were derived from that. Only one area was underrepresented: management reporting. Several reports were in scope, but as the project progressed, many additional reports were declared absolutely necessary, and they had to be added to the scope. The effort to produce these extra reports was beyond the contingency, and I also knew that the sponsor had no room to give additional budget. In the end, the problem was solved by swapping out some other functionality for which there apparently was a workaround, and keeping the extra reports in scope. As you see, this required some creativity. Next, I would want to say something about a topic that's very difficult to fully cover in any podcast, but that's extremely important for keeping track of how far you have come in creating and producing the deliverables. It is measuring of earned value. It's obviously linked to planning and to the product breakdown and work breakdown structures. Now, I've talked about PBS and WBS in episode 8 of this series on the project canvas. As you may recall, the PBS describes the deliverables and the WBS describes the work you must do to create them. This way, there is an effort estimation to every element of the PBS, or a cost estimation if you purchase certain components. For example, suppose that my estimation for deliverable X is that we will take 100 hours to build. So, if I've spent 50 hours already, I might think that I'm at a 50% progress. But it doesn't quite work this way. Why? Because the original estimate is only an estimate. So what I really do in a project is measure the hours already spent and then ask the developers how many hours they will still need to complete deliverable X. If she needs another 75 hours, then I'm really only at 25% progress, even though I've spent 50 hours of the originally budgeted 100. That is why this measurement is called earned value. The 50 hours of work have really only earned me 25 hours of real progress. Earned value analysis is a very powerful metric of analyzing how well you're doing in producing the deliverable as compared to the baseline of budget and time. By the way, I've talked about baselines in episode 8 of this podcast series, where I've also covered the planning. A final topic on producing deliverables is product quality. However, because I've already covered a few approaches to quality in episode 6, where I've talked about requirements and design, I won't repeat all of that here. You can check the extra materials on the website projectdoctor.online, specifically the split down of quality function deployment technique and the ISO 25101. As announced, The second part of this podcast is about using deliverables. The day-to-day practical use of deliverables is outside of the project itself. It will be business as usual. But immediately after go-live, there usually is something like the post-go-live support or hypercare or initial monitoring or whatever words are used in your sponsor's organization. And shortly before go-live, you will probably have training of end users as part of your project plan. And there will be specific handover activities that make up the actual go-live. These are important activities, but while you're busy going about even creating and building the deliverables, end user training and handover tasks don't get too much focus. Let's give an example. Already quite a few years ago, I ran a project where we delivered a tailor-made ERP system. The sponsor had seen that off-the-shelf packages would not fit their business, which by the way was producing corrugated boxes in a mix of make-to-order and make-to-stock. Believe me, this requires some rather specialist functionalities, and even today, for a powerhouse ERP like SAP, there are vendors of add-on modules to fill in the gaps for this specific industry. Anyway, the point is here that in this project we did take user training into account, but we both underestimated and overestimated the end users here. We overestimated them in the sense that the training materials were produced rather high level, and after the go-live we exposed the end users to a very steep learning curve. This obviously led to some frustration, and I've learned from that it makes sense to do trial training runs early enough before go live that you have time to improve the first draft of your training materials. But we also underestimated the end users because a few of them, key users, spontaneously coordinated between themselves to produce a quick reference document that filled in the gaps of the training materials we produced. And from that I learned that producing a quick reference card should be part of any software development project, because it's a great way to assist end users in the first weeks after go live, and later on it proves also to be a great tool for new employees who join and who need to learn how to work with the system. Everything that is helpful in putting the deliverables to the best possible use will also be helpful in reaching the goals of the project and in fulfilling the business case. And that's the primary reason why you've been creating these deliverables after all, because they are expected to help the sponsor in realizing the benefits. Otherwise, she would not have made all the resources available to you and would not have appointed you as a project manager in the first place. So let's wrap up this episode. What has been covered? I've talked about producing deliverables and about using deliverables. Under producing, I've talked about deliverables lifecycle, about operationalisation, and about earned value. Under using deliverables, I've talked about post-go-live support, end user training, and the importance of putting deliverables to the best possible use. And with so many topics covered, you can do with some memory joggers. So please go to Project Doctor online to download the extra materials with this episode. Subscribe or follow and let me know your comments and reviews. I'm happy to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.